Hey guys, my name is Ryan and welcome to Overwatch Central. Today we're sitting down with Eviltoaster to talk about tanking in role queue and why there's a crisis going on at the moment that's affecting everybody in the game currently, and also what can be done about it. We'll go into detail in this video of exactly what that crisis is, but definitely check out Eviltoaster on Twitch. You can find all of his links in the description below, and of course you're seeing gameplay of him on screen. Notably, he's avoiding playing Orisa this season, which I think is another discussion for another day. But let's get started. Ever since Roblox Edition, as somebody that doesn't just play DPS, what has it been like for you? Has it been better? Has it been worse? Like, what kind of stuff have you experienced now that we've had like a month of role queue now?
Well, as a tank player specifically, role queue kind of makes the game a whole lot more enjoyable. Because before, when you're a tank player, you kind of are just hoping someone else on your team was also going to play tank. Because as role queue is now showing us, tank is the least popular role by a very large margin.
Does it mess with the game in any way? The tanks have really short cooldowns and everybody else has rather long cooldowns.
Well, for the queuing experience, it just makes it better because you'll get a game instantly. But there is this kind of big drawback that I kind of experienced more often when role queue started during the beta. And it still happens every now and then where you kind of get kind of mismatched because other players, like if you're a DPS player, let's say you're a 4000 SR, you're going to be in queue for like 20, maybe 30 minutes sometimes. And what's that going to mean is that the game is desperately trying to find the rest of the players to fill up your game as fast as it can within like a reasonable setting, because obviously it's not going to pull someone out of silver to fill out your game. But eventually it's going to reach farther into other ranks, and as soon as I queue up, the queuing system is like, oh look, a tank player that's just barely close enough to queue with this team, we'll just throw you in. So oftentimes, like there have been times when I'm like 4200 SR and I get put into a game where DPS and support players, or even the other tank player, are like 500 SR below me. And there are also other times where I get put into a game, like if I'm at 4000 SR, I'll get put into a 4400 game. And everyone there is like super pro, top 500. I'm playing like with pros on East Coast, or West Coast, I mean. So it's sometimes that it's kind of a problem because every other queue is desperately reaching for tank players. So as soon as you go in queue, you don't know if you're going to get a game that's even with your SR or somewhere higher or somewhere lower. That's kind of the only real drawback, though, for tanks.
Is that just a thing for the higher tiers, or have you had people speak to you about it from like Platinum or whatever, saying they've had similar things happen?
I've had a few players in Master who have had similar things happen, but I don't know if this reaches all the way down to the middle tiers because there's going to be more players in a larger available pool. So maybe it won't be as big of a deal, but I could only imagine that, you know, it probably happens just not as often.
Why do you think that is? I guess that's a whole discussion about tank play at the moment, but why do you feel that people aren't queuing up as tank much at the moment? Is it just because like the double barrier meta seems to be so prominent?
Well, I kind of feel like how I like to call it is there's a tanking crisis where there's just not enough tank players to fill up the game for everyone else. And it's this weird systematic issue, and trying to figure out where it stems from can be a lot of things. And if you ask me, I think the biggest problem is that the tanks that are most meta, or even just tanks as a whole, just aren't as fun or as engaging to play. Because right now, of course, most people will say that the best tank duo is Orisa and Sigma. And that having two barriers, as we already know, creates like this very boring kind of gameplay loop where players shoot a shield, and for like 2 seconds when both shields are down, hopefully you could do enough damage to kill someone, and if you don't, the barriers are back up and you have to try again. And that's separated with like 15 seconds of shooting shields. It's just, you know, it's really boring. No one wants to be part of it, and also no one wants to do the actual barrier creating job because that job is just as boring. Because with Orisa, you're making shield and you're shooting their shield. And if you're fighting the other Orisa, you're both just looking at each other the whole game. It's just not very engaging. And if you're Sigma, it's a little bit more fun. I think Sigma is actually pretty okay, but he's kind of just adding to the problem that already exists that's focused around Orisa. But whenever I do see people, I always let people first pick their tank anyway. So I'll queue, or okay, other tank player, what do you want to play? 80% of the time they just lock Sigma because, he's powerful, he's pretty fun to play, he's meta. So of course, play him. And if both tanks were like that, maybe it'd be okay, but even then, there's going to be plenty of people who don't want to play Sigma. They want to do the shooty. And if they were on tank, those same DPS players that would flex to tank sometimes in previous seasons, it was 60% of the time they would pick Zarya, because Zarya is the shooty tank. But now the meta tanks just don't really fill that itch for most players who come to Overwatch to play a first-person shooter. And that's understandable. But that just means that the whole game has this big issue of no one wants to play tanks, so everyone has long queue times except for tanks, and those tanks end up in mismatched games. So that's kind of a big problem.
I don't want to look at this as a way of saying role lock was bad for the game, because I think even you'd argue how much better the game feels now that it has a bit more organization, right?
Oh yeah, it's so much better.
But it does have its issues that I guess people expected. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, everyone has all these issues that they're pointing out is happening now, but people are going to very quickly forget all the problems we had before role lock. Because before role lock, you would queue up for Overwatch and you don't know if you're even going to be playing a real game of Overwatch. Because you might have 5 support mains on your team. You might have no tank players on your team, which is actually very likely. Or you might just end up with 4 or 5 DPS players and none of them want to play anything else, so they just lock it, and then you're not really playing Overwatch. And it was very clear that, Blizzard was right when they were saying the game is just more fun when people are playing 2-2-2. And it's the same thing that every other game that has eventually forced their meta onto the standard gameplay. League of Legends went through this when they forced the roles that we already decided was the most effective and the most fun, because when everyone did it, the game was better. And now here we are, the game is better because of role lock, but the issue, really the only big issue, is there's no tank players. Because DPS is complaining about queue times, or mismatching, or people not playing tank in their game, and just it's because there aren't tank players. The most common time that I see someone look at someone's profile and be like, man, they don't play this role, they shouldn't be in this game. It's because they're playing tank, but no one else plays tanks. They need more people to play tanks so they could even get in a game, but they're still complaining that there's something wrong. But this is the world we have wrought.
What other areas do you feel are problems that nobody really expected to happen with the addition of role lock?
I know one big thing that everyone kind of is complaining about now is the new placement systems, and how sometimes people get placed into an SR bracket where they don't belong. So for example, what everyone says is okay, let's say a support player is 4000 SR, but they never play tank. Well, now that role lock is out, they'll do their tank placements and they end up 4000 SR, but they aren't actually good at the role. And a lot of people will look at this for their case for why there needs to be an MMR reset, or why people shouldn't play off roles in comp, which is a ridiculous notion, by the way. And that's, sure, it's a problem, but it's also not, because all that has to happen is for them to play the game. And if they are truly only a 3500 tank player, they're going to drop to 3500 the more that they play tank. And if you are truly a 4000 DPS overlord, you're going to stay at 4000 SR no matter how much that person stays, because if you really think that, you'll avoid them. Sure, your queue time will go up by 10 minutes because you avoided a tank player, but if you're truly a capable 4000 SR gamer, one game where you had a mismatched tank player is not going to stop you from that SR. But that tank player will go drop down to 3,500 and you'll never see them again. But people play this game on such a game-by-game basis that they're not really looking at this big picture. They don't see that, like, after everyone plays 100 games or so, that matchmaking is going to be fine. And they don't realize that people doing the placements now, sure, maybe they get mismatched, maybe. And if they do, and I'll admit, sometimes it does happen, people get placed in a SR they don't belong. Kind of happened to me on my DPS, actually. I placed like 4,000 on my DPS, and now I'm 3,700 because I'm Garbo. But I dropped down that SR, and everyone who was complaining in my 4K DPS games are still 4K. The world hasn't ended because I was placed wrong. And they might say, oh, but it happens multiple times, so I lose multiple games. You probably don't notice when you win the games with a mismatched player, first off. And second off, like, it's not going to happen enough for so long that you're going to stop being 4,000 SR. And if you're going to, you know, if you're good enough to climb to 4,500 or something, then you won't be held back by worse players, because if you're 4,500 DPS, almost everyone's worse than you. But again, people don't play on the big picture. People don't look at, like, what's going to happen 1,000 games into the season, or I guess seasons are only 2 months now, like 500 games. So they just look, this game I lost because of this game I lost because of that. When if they just look at, like, what their progress is like over a week, they'll realize they're staying at the same SR average because that's the SR they belong. And that is that. But they're too short-sighted.
Is the game easier or harder to play now? Because I've seen a lot of people, maybe like support mains that were in Platinum, but ever since the addition of Rollock, they've gone all the way to like Masters and beyond. Just some anecdotal examples of people, but I feel that that's quite a common thing that's happened, that support players now have that better environment. So is it easier to play Overwatch now and climb than it was before?
I would say yes, if you are, how do you say it? It's like, the game is easier if you function in a functional environment better. Because if you're like a Widow player, let's say you're just a Widow superstar, dude, and like you could hit all your headshots, like you're 1v11, I would say the game is harder now, because you're more likely to be against a more organized team comp. But if you're a tank or support player especially, and even if you're a DPS and you try to play what would be considered standard cookie cutter gameplay styles, you will do better now, I'm pretty sure. And that kind of upsets the Widow superstars because, you know, it feels like a lot of their agency is being taken away. But if your ability to win is dependent on the disorganization of the enemy team, then yes, you're going to suffer a little bit more in Rollock. And I've noticed that not only in other players who are the Widow superstars, but also in myself, because, for example, like I was known for being like the flank Orisa in like season 17 or whatever, where I would just pick Orisa, walk to the enemy backline, and just start killing people and drawing attention. And it works really well against disorganized teams. But now it's really hard to do in Rollock, because now all of a sudden there's 2 supports, there's 2 tanks, and people aren't arguing over voice chat about who has to play what anymore. So there's a little bit more focus on the actual game, and there's always going to be tanks and supports. There's not like one support I have to kill and then we win, for example. So it's easier if you're playing, you know, basically the way that you should be, honestly. Like, if you're playing banking on the enemy team being bad, then you're not really a good player. So I guess if you're climbing now, then good for you. You were good all along. At least that's what I'm sure what they would like to hear, but it has an element of truth.
What would you like to see improved when it comes to the actual systems of Rollock? Less about the game balance and like the meta and stuff like that, but how Blizzard can make competitive a lot better of an experience no matter what's going on?
Well, one thing I kind of joked about was that, lately we've been hearing news about like Mixer buying out Ninja to stream on his platform, and then Twitch buying out Nick A to stream on Twitch. I was just like, well, if we could do this, surely we could just pay tank players to come into Overwatch and play tank, so that way everyone has shorter queues. Hint, hint, pay me to play tank. But obviously that's going to be that would not happen. You need to have tanks for all roles. Just pour them in from, I don't know, the freaking Paladins Pro League or something, and just bring them in here. But there would never be enough. Like, the better solution is to figure out how to make tanking better, because honestly, I feel like the biggest problem with Rollock, not necessarily the meta, but Rollock right now, is just the tanking crisis, where there's just not enough tanks to get queue times for other roles to be like good enough, because it's such a huge contrast. I have 30-second queue times every single game for an entire day, like 7 hours of streaming Overwatch. Meanwhile, DPS players, I literally watch their streams, there's like 20, 30, sometimes an hour-long queue times. It's ridiculous. So, and that goes for support players too. I see support players with 20-minute queue times. Like, it's literally just tanks that are the problem. There needs to be more tanks. There needs to be an incentive to have more tank players. And I don't know the best way to do that, because tank players, like, there's so many different aspects to it. Like, tank players are abused a lot by their peers, dude. Like I mean, so it kind of happens to supports too, and maybe I'm biased, but I feel like tank players get a lot more verbal abuse from teammates when they're not doing what the teammates think they should do, even though none of them play tank, clearly. And tank gameplay right now is just so straightforward. It's just such a flowchart that, like, it's not engaging. People don't want to do it, and then they end up queuing as tank and not playing the tank that they want, that they think that they should, which is what's happening with me right now. Like, I have known to be the Orisa one-trick guy since, season 5. And this season, I'm swearing off Orisa and playing literally every other tank, because by doing so, the game is fun to me again. Because if I play Orisa every game, and I have tried to play Orisa every game, I'm just like, I'm sitting here, I'm shooting shield, I'm basically falling asleep, dude, playing Orisa. And it's not even because I don't like Orisa, because I do like to play Orisa in a vacuum. But when you're playing Orisa into double barrier, into another Orisa, in this meta in particular, you don't do anything. You don't do anything. You just sit there being a front line that the enemy team can't walk past, while the rest of your team has fun. Doomfist goes and one-shots people, Symmetra does a bazillion damage, your supports get to make plays with ultimates, and your Sigma gets to, do anything. Meanwhile, you just sit there. Like, no one wants to do it. No one does. So I don't. And I play Reinhardt, I play Winston, I play Zarya, I play Roadhog. I'll play everything else. And it gets me a lot of hate. But if everyone did it, more people would be willing to play tank. And queue times would be shorter, and tanking would be more fun. The meta would be more fun. Everything would be better. Which kind of makes it sound like I'm just saying remove Orisa, and I know some people actually believe that. But I don't think that's obviously not the right way to go about it. But something's got to be done about the tanking meta.
And that's it for this time. Thank you very much for watching. Do check out Eviltoaster on twitch.tv/Eviltoaster. All of his stuff is linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, take care. We'll see you then.